Mr. Speaker, what is my point of departure? The closing comments of the Minister for Finance on this legislation, and in particular, his reference to issues and problems in the banking sector. Perhaps I should preface my comments by saying that I'm very familiar with the legislation under review, and history speaks, because I recall I was the Minister of Finance at the time who had the unenviable task of reviewing the draft legislation, which is now law, and persuading member states that they should subscribe to that legislation. In fact, we spent several hours at a hotel here in St. Lucia to persuade unwilling member states to agree to this harmonized package of legislation. And in fairness, largely at the behest of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, because at the time we had faced major issues in the banking sector in the region. You had collapses in Antigua, shortly after Willa, and then I'm certain the member of us as well will recall the immense pressure that faced the Bank of St. Lucia at the time. And I certainly will never ever forget that day, Mr. Speaker, or that week, Mr. Speaker, when officials from the IMF, Bank and the World Bank arrived in St. Lucia to monitor events unfolding at the bank, primarily the meeting of the shareholders to discuss the then statement of accounts of the Bank of St. Lucia for that particular year. It was feared then that the bank would have gone under because shareholders as well as depositors would have panicked, and there would have been mass withdrawal from that bank. It was, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, an exceedingly challenging experience, because for the first time we had to be calling talk show hosts to caution against making outrageous statements that could undermine the bank and lead to panic. And we had to dispatch several persons to meet with television stations, radio stations, to caution again about the statements that could be issued from their particular stations or television or on their television programs. And all the while we had IMF officials breathing down our necks. And so Dwight Venner, who was then the governor of the central bank, also had to come down to monitor the situation. And discussions had to be held with several major shareholders to plead with them to leave their deposits at the bank to see us through this period. I had many sleepless nights, Mr. Speaker, but fortunately for us, we were able to calm the depositors, calm shareholders, and we survived. And after that, the bank then had to make major adjustments, and today it is good to see that it's now stronger, it's now viable, and that I'm hoping that it would have learned its mistakes, because a lot of the problem had to do with loans that were very poorly secured. And there was far too much generosity on the part of the bank to particular lenders. But that is another story. And so, following these experiences, it was felt that this legislation was necessary, was vital, to stem any other potential collapse of any bank throughout the region. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm exceedingly aware of the provisions of that Act, And the provisions in the Act that caused considerable unhappiness among member states and certainly among certain governments. And as I said earlier, I had the huge task of calling governments, persuading them that, look, we had a situation in our hands that we had to deal with. It's an untold story, Mr. Speaker, because at the time we had taken the position that it was best not to go public with all the issues, because that would have added even more fuel to the fire then, and may have even precipitated the very collapse that we are seeking to avert. It was not just the Bank of St. Lucia, but First National had also gone through a very difficult period, and they too had to be brought under some degree of management by the central bank to see them through what was a very difficult experience. I laugh sometimes, Mr. Speaker, when I see the behavior of certain individuals and certain officials, and when I see how resources of the bank have been used and have been deployed, totally oblivious to the particular history that has shaped the future of the bank. Having said all that, Mr. Speaker, my problem with the central bank has always been its insensitivity to depositors at the banks. No one really seems to care what consumers endure and suffer at the hands of banks in St. Lucia and in the region. And if I were to ask, Mr. Speaker, who has the power to inquire into the treatment of consumers and to prescribe regulatory behavior on the part of banks, I suspect that I will not get an answer to that question. Does the power reside in the individual ministers of finance to order inquiries into these matters, or does the power reside in the central bank? The fact of the matter is, when you look at the history of the central bank, it has never seemed to be seen, in my eyes, to be concerned about depositors. All it seemed to be concerned about is whether the books are healthy, whether the banks follow the guidelines issued by the central bank, whether they report to the bank, whether they are honest in what they report, and of course, whether they are maintaining the relevant balances that they are required to maintain. For example, your deposit ratios or your lending to deposit ratios. These are the things they get preoccupied with. But ask them, what are you doing to protect ordinary citizens? They can't tell you. And that's my problem. At the sitting of the House over the budget, I recall complaining bitterly about some of the practices of the banks. The reactions to my statements were interesting, Mr. Speaker. Of course, there were a flurry of exchanges between bankers, that's what I said. And you know, I always get into trouble. I don't mind getting into trouble for the sake of the people of this country. One bank in particular, and I was quite impressed by that, called me in and said, well, can we have a chat with you and let us hear what it is that you're complaining about, etc. And I went in and had a very lengthy and useful discussion and shared what I thought were some of the inimical practices, etc. But Mr. Speaker, those problems remain unattended. And I don't think the Minister of Finance will get anywhere with the central bank and the governor of the central bank, because he seems to be preoccupied, as I said, with the wrong things. And it seems to me that we have now reached a point where an inquiry has to be launched into the practices of existing banks, particularly the fees that they are charging for basic services to citizens. Something has to be done, Mr. Speaker. I accept that we have a monumental problem on the foreclosure side. I accept that without reservation. I know, for example, Mr. Speaker, in certain parts of this country, there are houses that are empty, and part of the problem is that the banks have difficulty foreclosing because of the peculiarity of our laws. But that too, there's a story behind that. The banks, whenever you meet with them, constantly point to the huge portfolio of unpaid mortgages and their insistence that they cannot make more money available for on-lending unless and until that portfolio of debt is dealt with. Now, we have seen one possible resolution of that issue, particularly following the sale of the Bank of Nova Scotia to the Republic Bank, and one or two other initiatives taken by banks where they have actually sold mortgages, unpaid mortgages, to third parties who then inherit these loans, renegotiate, and of course tackle those loans. I personally believe that legislation should be introduced to facilitate initiatives of that kind. But it cannot be left at large, because what is happening is a new entity has, for example, entered St. Lucia called Ascendancy Limited, and they are now, of course, negotiating with on-lenders for loans that have gone toxic. I do not wish to cast judgment, except to say that I believe that it is a welcome initiative that they are holding dialogue with defaulting borrowers to see if they can have these matters resolved. But maybe we have to begin to look at our domestic space, assess to what extent the banking legislation, and in particular the central bank, can intervene in our domestic space in relation to matters affecting consumers, because we have to deal with it. We have to deal with it. I say, Mr. Speaker, it has been a fascinating experience to be back in the world of practice as a lawyer. And new windows, new opportunities have arisen by my decision to reopen my legal practice. And you see the issues on a daily basis. Individuals who are struggling, who, Mr. Speaker, are paying as much as they can, particularly over the last couple of years, to deal with their loans, and then they shut the doors in their face and haul them before the courts, sometimes to get default judgments, because these poor people don't know where to turn or what to do in the circumstances. No one, Mr. Speaker, speaks for these individuals or worry about these individuals. None. And it is left to the ingenuity of the lawyers with very few legal options to be able to deal with these matters. And Mr. Speaker, I have seen so many tears in the last couple of years from persons who have the experience of coping with defaulting loans. And Mr. Speaker, I will be the first person to say to you that in many cases these people were devoted, they were dedicated, and Mr. Speaker, they were overwhelmed in circumstances totally beyond their control. How do you explain to me, Mr. Speaker, a man has a loan for 20 years. He pays the loan for 18 years. It actually paid off principal, paid off interest, Mr. Speaker, or whatever. And then 2 years left of the loan, the bank goes after him because he encounters difficulty, Mr. Speaker. And you haul him to court, Mr. Speaker. When in truth and in fact, what you loan him, the principal, has been paid over and over. I don't think people understand what it means to take a mortgage for 20 or 25 years and then pay a certain specified amount every month, and how much the payments accumulate to, and what in fact the banks make after they have done that. Mr. Speaker, consumers deserve better. The central bank does not protect them. The central bank has no interest in protecting them. And you know why I say that, Mr. Speaker? Harsh as that judgment may be, because when I served as Minister of Finance in St. Lucia, I raised it with them. I said, why are you leaving consumers at the mercy of banks? Why are you only interested purely in the regulatory arrangements so that you can be more efficient in tackling and going after banks? How many times, Mr. Speaker, you hear Banks telling you when they meet a difficult situation, well, you know, we have to do this because the central bank says so. And sometimes, Mr. Speaker, whatever the central bank tells them may not never exist, but they find the central bank a place of refuge. My problem, Mr. Speaker, when I come to legislation like this, is to continue to express those concerns about what ordinary people are going through in the banking sector. Look at the situation that we face. We have gone through COVID. And I want to applaud those banks, Mr. Speaker, who reached out to individuals, who decided to give them moratoriums on their loans. What has happened? We have not returned to normalcy. The banks have been back at it again with a vengeance, asking for their interest and asking for payments of principal on these loans. Some of these people have hardly ever got off their feet, Mr. Speaker. And I'm particularly concerned about the small business people who, for one reason or another, could not sustain themselves during COVID and had to enter into difficulty. And you know what the tragedy, Mr. Speaker, is? Most of these banks come and tell you that they can't renegotiate, they can't reschedule the loans. You have to pay what you owe. I mean, those things can never be right, and those things can never be correct, Mr. Speaker. Can never, ever be right. And I want to urge the Minister of Finance to seriously consider putting a team together and appointing a team to review the practices of banks in St. Lucia and the treatment meted out to consumers. And I will place on record, as I've said before, I am glad that Royal Bank of Canada has left the shores of St. Lucia. I am happy Nova Scotia has disappeared. Now, that may sound unkind, Mr. Speaker, because they are around for several years. And I have warned in this House before about the diminution of interest of Canadians in investment in our islands, because they were the first to run when the economies got difficult. And as you know, they were not too keen on assisting governments dealing with financing issues. They were the first to bail out and say they ain't taking bonds and so on. When these islands needed these banks the most, that is when they disappeared the fastest. And the way they treated consumers in their closing days, Mr. Speaker, used St. Lucian workers to go after people who had loans in the bank. I mean, it was sad, distressing, and no one could speak on behalf of those St. Lucians after that kind of experience. And today, Mr. Speaker, what you see happening is that there are hundreds of St. Lucians who have left the traditional banks and gone to establish business, of course, in the credit unions. But these days, the central bank now is hungry going after the credit unions. When I was in office, Mr. Speaker, they tried it. I've seen the legislation they have introduced. A lot of people don't know that the cooperative legislation that exists in this country, I'm the one who drafted it, you know. That cooperative legislation that you see empowering credit unions, I'm the one who drafted it. I drafted it for St. Lucia when I was KVIV at the University of West Indies, so I know it inside out. But what they're trying to do now is to replace it, to ensure that they diminish the independence of these credit unions and to place them under regulatory control of the central bank, because they claim that these credit unions are now havens for money laundering. But when the time comes, I'm going to urge the House to do its best to protect the independence of these credit unions. And the other reason for that, of course, is to provide St. Lucians with additional opportunities for banking services, which the traditional banks no longer provide. Because these traditional banks have no room for poor people again, you know. They have no interest in poor people again, you know. You watch them with their deposit practices and what they demand you have in their banks. All of them now is ATMs. You, Mr. Speaker, you try and call any bank in this country and see if anybody will answer you. You know, Mr. Speaker, for you to have a conversation, you know what to do? You have to get somebody who knows someone inside a bank. And then can you send me the number of X or Y person so I can talk to about my account or my situation, Mrs. Speaker? That's how it goes. And you want to tell me that we not ought or not be concerned about ordinary citizens and banking services in this country? Just because somebody has to come to the assistance of consumers. Now, I want to be clear. I don't want banks being treated unfairly. They are vital intermediaries in our lives. We all need banks. We all. But surely there has to be mechanisms in place that can tell a bank when their behavior is excessive and it is unwarranted, because these are not good banking practices. And the Minister of Finance is correct. Something has to be chronically wrong with the approach to establishing banking accounts in this country. If you have a bank account right now, you have to hold on to it for dear life. Because if there's any reason that a bank decides that your banking account has become non-functional, or you have been assigned to that category where they, of course, remove you off the books from time to time, then you're in trouble. You are in trouble. So you have to hold on to your account for dear life. But some authority has to be in place to determine and to settle how banks should grant permission for the opening of accounts. They cannot continue to use money laundering as the eternal excuse for penalizing ordinary and decent citizens. And if it is that they're concerned about the money launderers in our midst and those who set up accounts to engage in unlawful or illegal activity, there are mechanisms for doing so. There's a financial intelligence unit. Get in touch with them and ask for the banking records of these individuals. What do you know about them? Don't go and penalize citizens all over the place. And as for the other one, Mr. Speaker, I've said so in this House before, so this is nothing new. This regime that penalizes politicians, I will support this. I resent being discriminated against because I'm a politician. That it is assumed because I am a politician, I should not be treated fairly. Something wrong with me. I will never forget, Mr. Speaker, that a niece of mine wanted insurance at Massey Insurance for a vehicle. She went up to Massey, and then they asked her, "Is Kenny Anthony your uncle?" And when she said, "Yeah, he is my uncle," they denied her and told her that she is politically what? Politically exposed. If my niece was brave enough, I would have sued Massey. Atrocious behavior. What does that have to do with an insurance policy? Or I could tell my niece, Mrs. Speaker, why are you going to insure your vehicle with Massey? Tell your father to remove all his vehicles from Massey. There are enough insurance companies who won't ask you that kind of foolish question. That's the kind of behavior we accept and we allow our consumers to endure. So, Mr. Speaker, in summary, what I'm saying is this. While I heard the pleas of the Minister of Finance that this is harmonized legislation, that we have to be committed to what we signed up to with the central bank, I am also saying that the central bank should be put on notice that it is not serving the interests of consumers in this region, and serving the interests of consumers does not mean setting up a regulatory machinery that only protects the interests of the banking sector and the central bank itself. That we need mechanisms to be able to protect consumers, and the time has come for us to do an assessment of banking practices in this country to reach out and protect our consumers. Of course, I am not afraid of being quoted in the corridors of decision making. So what I have said in this House, they can take it to the central bank and tell all of them, because that has been my historical position, Mr. Speaker. So this is nothing new coming from me. And this is because I'm part of an elected government I will say this. I will always say what I believe in. And that's one of the things I believe in. That the central bank is doing a disservice to consumers. And it has to end. And what St. Lucian consumers are going through is not reasonable, it's not fair, and it's not justified. I'm concerned not just about liquidity, but about the treatment of the people of St. Lucia by the institutions in their midst. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.